Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar titled, Are You Ready for Increased Regulatory Scrutiny? Start thinking about your compliance workflows. We have a great presentation in store for you thanks to our sponsor, Hyperproof. Here with us are two fantastic speakers, Tom Wilcox and Jason Martino. Tom is Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Hyperproof. He is a highly engaged C-suite executive with over 25 years of work experience in startups and large organizations. He served as CIO and CISO at several businesses where he has implemented industry best practices and current trends and strategy to ensure a continuous optimal security posture. Next, we have Jason. Jason is VP of Security and CISO at Cortelligent. He is responsible for Cortelligent's internal cybersecurity programs, governance, risk, and compliance activities, educating both staff and customers on an ever-evolving threat landscape. Jason has held several technical and advisory roles primarily in the life sciences and financial services industries, preparing and remediating items for both FDA inspections and SEC examinations. To learn more about Tom and Jason and ways to connect with them, please check out the speaker window to the right of your console. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom to start the session. Tom, you may begin.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks to all those that have joined us today. We all live in a special world where I think most people would run away from it. But Jason, you and I, and most of the people that are going to be joining us today choose every day to live in information security and compliance. So puts us in rare company. So, we are going to talk a lot about some of the drivers that are pushing the scrutiny in our worlds today in terms of compliance. But we do hope that as we educate and learn together, we can also teach you some ways to apply that knowledge. So I'm Tom Wilcox, and Jason, it's good to see you again. We've been on the camera together quite a few times in the last couple of weeks, but it's good to see you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, Tom.
All right, so as we spoke about, there are several drivers that are increasing the regulatory compliance scrutiny. I think most of those are pretty obvious. I meet as somebody who works in a GRC centric organization. We build the GRC platform. I'm talking with customers every single day, and it is clear to me that they are under increased pressure. They're giving me feedback as to what they need and what they would like to see happen in the tools that they use. So, Jason, you work in a services industry too around IT. Are you seeing some of the same kinds of things?
I am. Yeah, I think I'm seeing two major drivers for this, increased regulatory scrutiny. So I think the first thing I'm seeing, and I know everyone here is it's a response to real world events. So there's an increase in ransomware, data breaches, business email compromise across all sectors, right? Schools, hospitals, towns, businesses, and really our societal functions are experiencing major disruptions due to cybercrime. There's been a lot of towns and cities hit by cyber attacks. I know, one in New Hampshire, another in Texas, where residents, couldn't pay their bills online. The government couldn't process payroll. Police officers couldn't access the records they needed, right? So, companies are losing money as well. They're being forced to close, anyone from small businesses to large corporations. So I think that's the first thing I'm seeing. And the second thing would be, well, there's an acceleration to the cloud, right? There has been, and a dependency for third parties to deliver services. So really saw that happening in the 2010s, further accelerated by the pandemic. And there's lots of logical reasons why you want to use third parties. Have limited resources and staff. It's hard to secure your own email server, or things are better aligned with your company's cash flow, right, by using SaaS services. But it also exposes your organization to a lot of unknowns due to that loss of visibility. And I think that's where the regulations come in. So, what I see is the government's response to compliance, it's always reactive, right? It's not proactive. So that gives you an idea of why there's more attention paid to those areas where existing regulations are being enforced, and we're seeing more regulations being proposed.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. So let's explore a little bit more on some of these topics, because I think it's interesting, sort of put an envelope around what is happening in the industry. So, as you mentioned, there's breaches every day in the news. It seems like, you've got big names that are hitting the top line on newspapers and websites. Morgan Stanley, Uber. You're seeing tremendous business impacts, and you're seeing consumers take the brunt of a lot of the data loss. You're also seeing the federal government suddenly starting to step in and say, hey, I've got constituents that are begging us to do something. And so they're going to start, throwing new law and regulation out. So I really see a main driver being, hey, we have just a ton of breaches in the news, and legislators are paying attention to that same news. Jason, kind of describe what you're seeing there.
I think what I'm seeing is companies really aren't taking these issues seriously enough, right? Now, it's good to think critically. So, we see the news articles in front of us, and we should be asking ourselves, okay, well, what are we seeing and hearing versus what's the reality? So I'll share an example. There's plenty of research that shows that the American public as a whole perceives crime as on the rise, whereas stats show it's been declining for decades, right? But what we're hearing about all these cyber attacks and breaches is absolutely true. I mean, the reality is cybercrime is an epidemic. We were sharing an article last month that mentioned by 2025, it's expected cybercrime will cost the world economy $10 trillion annually. Now, to put that into perspective, if cybercrime were a country, it would have the third largest GDP behind the US and China, right? So it's a huge problem. It's only getting worse. And again, this isn't just affecting Fortune 500 companies, but businesses of all sizes from all industries. There's another report that I know you and I look forward to every year, Verizon's Data Breach Investigations Report. So the one from 2022, it showed that the majority of publicly known incidents and breaches really impacted businesses with fewer than 1,000 employees.
That's right. So it's a small business target. Yeah, absolutely. Those are two reports that I read religiously every year. So for the folks that are listening, if you're not familiar with Verizon's data breach incident report, you should put that on your yearly list of reading, even if all you read is the executive summary portion of it's very good. And then the Ponemon Institute puts a good one out as well. Those are probably, I think that's where your statistic came from. I'm not positive, but I think that's where I remember seeing it for the first time anyway. Those are great resources and really help you understand where you're seeing risk increase and where targets are being painted by the bad guys. So this one shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. The next one, I think, equally not a huge surprise. We have seen, post-pandemic, even at the early stages of the pandemic, we saw a rush to the cloud. Remote workers, SaaS apps. You saw things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams get adopted in ways at a pace that we had never seen before. It's just a different world, and in that different world, we have different risks. Jason, you work a lot with banking, but you have some cross-industry experience too. Where have you seen this push to the cloud start to impact business?
Sure. Well, I think there's two things here, right? There's the decentralized networks and the increase in cloud. So let's start with the first one. So, what does decentralized networks mean? And for me, it's it's no longer about being tied to a physical office location. I'm reminded about a discussion I had with an auditor last week. They were asking, it was a risk assessment, they were asking about full tunnel VPNs. So I explained the requirement to use full tunnel VPNs is sort of outdated in 2023, has been for years as the perimeter has shifted from a physical office network to the user identity and endpoints, right? Pandemic exacerbated that dynamic. As employees are more readily working outside the office. I mean, right now, I think both of us are in our homes, right?
That's right.
But it's a risk, right? So we should all be thinking about how right, there's no physical boundary where all our assets are stored and protected. So how do we improve that?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to say that 2021 was the year of third party risk, as a reaction to this huge push in 2020 to the cloud. The reality is we still see that as an enormous risk. My own company put out a 2023 benchmark survey to all of our customers and clients. Respondents were really clear where they're seeing risk. 54% of those respondents indicated that there was a supply chain disruption to them from a cybersecurity perspective that impacted their ability to deliver goods or services. To me, that's a huge number. When you start to think about where we were a decade ago, that wouldn't have been the case. 48% said, "Hey, we have compliance violations in our organization that is a direct result of third party and our oversight into third party." Mm-hmm. Those same folks are saying, "Hey, we're having a hard time, dealing with those compliance hiccups that are occurring with our third party risk." So it's not like in the last 3 years we've completely solved this problem, right? This problem continues to plague us, and I think there is a tremendous scale to this issue that we have to contend with as an IT organization, IT security, and industry, that I don't think we have all the solutions yet in place, but we certainly are starting to wrap our arms around how this risk is increased, and certainly where risk management needs to change to meet the new challenges.
Right, and I don't think many companies realize it, but they are responsible for the risk of the third parties they're using. So I'm not talking about the security of the cloud versus in the cloud. There's plenty of content on that subject.
Sure.
But what I'm seeing is, too many companies are treating vendor due diligence as a checkbox exercise, right? Visiting Microsoft's trust centers and downloading their SOC 2 reports. It isn't going to make you secure, and it isn't necessarily enough to be compliant, right? So I think everyone. Here's the takeaway. Here's what you should be doing. Know the vendors and third parties you're working with. Understand who is accessing, storing, or processing your data. How critical is that third party to your organization? And then start to categorize vendors based on risk, and have that inform how you mitigate that risk through controls. And there we go. That's the secret formula, right, on how to get started with third-party risk management. It's something that is quickly becoming a more defined regulatory compliance requirement.
Yeah, I think almost every major framework now has a piece about third-party risk. I would just add that if you are using it as a yearly checkbox, then you're doing it wrong. You should build into your third-party risk management platform the continuous monitoring that needs to go in place that allows you to understand if you have an increased risk inside of a third party that you maybe didn't have when you initially assessed them. So there's lots of tools out there. I'm not going to name names, but certainly building out a continuous risk posture when it comes to your third party risk is important. All right, probably the one that impacts me most is we have seen the government taking an absolute active role in pushing out new regulation. They're responding to pressure from their own constituency. When you see in the news that 40 million records were stolen, those 40 million people, some portion of those folks are going back and talking to their local legislators. And certainly numbers matter in that game. Again, in our own benchmark survey, 40%, or 42% of those surveyed experienced a breach in the last 24 months. So there's a lot of data that's leaking right now, and the government is trying to respond to that. We see certainly a increased pressure in terms of the frequency in the specificity of control that government is pushing down. We also see that they are taking the ownership of information security extremely serious, meaning they are pushing into organizations the requirement that the very top line of the organization understands their information security risk, which is I would say is a different approach than what we've had in the last decade. So lots of stuff going on here. Jason, what are you seeing?
Yep. So, most of my focus is around financial services. So specifically, I've worked with our, private equity, venture capital, broker-dealer clients who have SEC and FINRA regulatory compliance requirements. So that's what I've been really interested in. So these are companies that they're taking other people's money and either have a duty or a standard on how those investments need to be handled. So, I sort of think about the other side, right? If you were an investor, where would you want to invest your money, right? You would want your investments to be stable, right? With companies that are resilient to disruptions. You want your personal data to be safe and secure. So, you perform due diligence on a fund or a company, you find out if they meet your standards or, specific compliance requirements. And, ultimately compliance builds trust, right? I repeat that a lot. I'll repeat it again. Compliance builds trust. And that's what I'm seeing with how the government is using regulatory compliance to build trust, which is used to support healthy business ecosystems. I'll give you an example. So, I've helped numerous clients with SEC audits or examinations. And for those that aren't familiar, SEC is the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. So our clients are being asked about, policies, asset management, vulnerability management, incident response, vendor management. And it's not enough to have a policy, but you have to show how you're following that policy, right? So, the reality is companies are sometimes doing the bare minimum to secure personal information and records, which is another reason why there's government regulations, right? But
that's a great point. I mean, you touched on it. I want to underline it, and that's we got away for years in having what I call a paper tiger, right? Which was an information security program that was largely written down but not followed. I went into organizations large and small as a consultant, and that's what I saw. I saw a stance on paper that was not in practice operationally. This is a huge problem, and it's no longer sufficient. Audit has gotten smarter, but certainly the federal government has gotten smarter too. So they're now introducing continuous monitoring into their legislation, and they're pushing it down. You mentioned you work with the SEC in those regulations often. I live in a world called FedRAMP every day. That's for those who are familiar with NIST 800.53, FedRAMP is a variant of that. So I'm working with 325 controls, and almost none of them allow me to just have a piece of paper. So it's a very different world we live in today than we did, a decade ago. Again, I think I keep using a decade ago, Jason. Maybe I'm just trying to remember my 30s, but the reality is I just didn't have the same level of scrutiny that the federal government now pushes down.
And there's even more scrutiny, almost in the form of peer pressure, right? So what I find is interesting is that what the SEC is doing now, another way that they're forcing compliance downward, is they have these press releases where they essentially name and shame companies. It's, hey, a company wasn't keeping proper records. We fine them $250,000. In reality, that $250,000 is probably a fraction of what they make, but the reputational damage is a lot larger, right? So, hey, they weren't compliant, and now they need to repair the damage that the lack of trust has brought to their business.
Yeah, I agree. So we've talked a little bit about all of these variables that are pushing scrutiny into compliance. Now let's talk a little bit about how we can deal with it. I get weighed down by the problem. I'd much rather talk about some of the solutions that we have. So let's talk about how we can optimize and how we can build some efficiencies into your GRC program, and maybe take some of the pressures that you're feeling and make them more routine.
Yeah, I think the technology, just one moment on that, technology really changing rapidly, right? Businesses have to compete. In addition to keeping up with these regulatory changes, it can be a tough balance. So I think that's why, right, there's been this whole proliferation of GRC practices to make that interaction between people, processes, and technology just more efficient. So for me, it's all about better collaboration, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
we've thrown around GRC a couple times. I suppose I should define that. GRC in the broad scale is governance, risk, and compliance. When we talk about GRC platforms, it's pieces of software that are purpose built to help manage GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance in your environment. So I work for a GRC platform called Hyperproof. So let's talk about some of the things that we can do. Probably one of my favorite things to do anytime I've walked into an organization is ask how cybersecurity risk is aligned to business risk. And it means more and more today than it has in the past, meaning that, as we talked about, federal government is pushing down ownership and making sure people understand that top line board, CEO are responsible for risk, including cybersecurity. They're responsible to understand the costs associated with their compliance and invest appropriately in those things. So it's no longer, hey, I can have a straw man between me and in leadership called the CISO, and he'll take the fall. Certainly he'll take responsibility, and he might get fined as well, but likely more and more so will your board, and so will your CEO. So just a couple statistics that I think are fascinating that came out of our IT benchmark survey. 85% of respondents surveyed said they now have board members with cybersecurity experience, which I can tell you from sitting on boards that number is significantly on the rise. And this is a result of some of those pressures. What's also interesting is 14% said, hey, we're going to put somebody with cybersecurity experience on the board. So, if I did the math on that correctly, that's 99% of our respondents were really starting to align up and down the business. It makes me wonder where that 1% is and what they're thinking. But, I think of this bullet point, aligning risk and compliance, as very much, hey, do you have priority aligned from security all the way up to the board? I think you think about it slightly different, Jason. What triggers your mind when we talk about this?
Sure. Well, I have to say, for those that know me, alignment is one of my favorite words, right? So, as you mentioned, it really can be challenging to align IT, like security and compliance, to the goals and initiatives of the rest of the business, right? I think as IT professionals, I had a technical role before this. We haven't always done a good job interpreting risk to an executive audience. We sometimes get stuck in technical specifics or use terminology that's not shared, right? So I think what I'm doing, and when we look at these challenges differently, through a risk lens, right, then it becomes easier to tell a story, and that story is compliance risk and cyber risk is business risk. Okay, so a lack of compliance that could lead to fines. Right? Underdeveloped security, well, that could lead to an incident or breach. And then, like you mentioned, there's new regulations that are holding CEOs and CISOs legally responsible for decisions they've made to, say, hide the severity of a breach or cyber attack. Right? So I think there's this old thinking that IT is always a cost center, right? But the reality is security and compliance are becoming a huge business differentiator. But how do you get there, right? How do you operationalize, right, that alignment, that magic word between security and compliance and the business?
Yeah, I think that's right. I should at least mention some things that I've done in my career to, help align. You mentioned some things. Certainly, I think the story piece of it is important. One of the things I've always done is I've always maintained two different risk registers, and then I've brought them together for executive meetings. Meaning I'll have a cybersecurity risk register, and then I'll have input into a business risk register. I can't share a cybersecurity risk register in its native format with the executive suite because they just simply won't understand the words. But what I can do is summarize, right? So if on my risk register I have things like JSON CVEs or I have 54 medium vulnerability findings, that's not going to mean much. But if I can say, hey, our vulnerability management program is healthy or not healthy, that's a risk I can communicate up to the executive suite, and I can help them understand better what that means to their overall risk posture. The important thing is we have our risks in front of them, summarized and stated in ways that they can understand. And we allow them to have a prioritization and a dollar conversation around risk as a whole, where we are at that table. Where before we might have been scraping for budget without informing that executive suite where those risks lie. So this gives them a chance to have a conversation with you, understand better the technical risk, but ultimately comply with the regulation that they're being pushed, right?
And that's a great idea, creating 2 separate risk registers. I may take that one and use it myself.
Yeah, I didn't patent it, so it's all you. All right, so probably my favorite slide of the day is going to be talking about how we can really push some efficiency into your operations by automating things in your environment. And this might be crosswalks or evidence collection, and certainly the testing of controls. So I know a lot about this because I live in this world every single day. I work for a company that builds a platform that does all this, but I also, as I build out my FedRAMP program in Hyperproof, I am consistently worrying about, okay, how can I take the data that I'm building out, the controls that I'm building, and how can I get those to be beneficial in other platforms? And that's really what Crosswalk is all about, is can I take a base set of controls and apply them across multiple frameworks to decrease my energy, time, resource, and money spend to stay compliant. So Jason, you do a lot of Crosswalk in your environment as well. You kind of tell me how this has benefited you.
Sure. So yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, crosswalking is letting businesses scale their framework compliance faster and easier, right? So two things that are considered the gold standard, SOC 2, ISO 27001, they share controls, right? There's actually an upwards of 80% overlap. They're both asking about things like security awareness training, audit log collection and analysis, media handling. Right? So crosswalking really helps you save time by linking what you've already done from one framework and apply it to another. And remember what I said earlier about not just having a policy, but a practice, right? How do you show an auditor that? I think it's with evidence. That evidence could be procedures, screenshots, reports, spreadsheets, etc. And so, using a platform that has, evidence collection integrations, that saves time. We talked about earlier, more and more companies using like SaaS platforms and third parties. And so now GRC platforms can easily connect to these SaaS platforms, right? Generate the information that you need, which is really great when you have 100 or 200, I think in your case, right, 300 controls to manage.
Plus,
yeah. And, all these activities that we're talking about, that can help ease the pain of an audit. I think we both undergone audits, right? And sometimes if you're new to it, they can be intimidating. Or you ask yourself, am I prepared? Have I been doing enough? Am I going to pass? What happens if I don't pass this audit? So I think, augmenting your security and compliance practices with, the right technology and processes and a trusted partner, I think that all gives you, more confidence in responding to an audit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'll say it's intimidating. If you're not prepared for audit, it's intimidating whether you've been doing it for 1 year or 15 years. I mean, it's intimidating to walk into an audit and not know exactly where you sit from a compliance perspective. And GRC platforms are built to help you be more prepared for that. On evidence collection, I lived in a world of spreadsheets. So I would have a spreadsheet of sources. Sometimes they're URL links. Sometimes they're literally, I've put notes in there that said, hey, go see Jason about S3 bucket encryption, right? Mm-hmm. Using a spreadsheet's terribly inefficient, and it is naturally open to error or omission. with evidence collection built into your GRC platform, you can automate all the collection that you used to have tracked in a spreadsheet and you had to do manually. So for instance, in my S3 bucket instance, if you have a platform that's capable, your platform can reach out to your AWS implementation. It can pull the S3 metadata, and it can identify whether or not you are encrypted to the level of standard which your policy states. That's a huge boon for people who've had to do all this stuff manually. And in a smaller organization where maybe that's a small team, maybe it's just one person that's pulling all that information, suddenly you are freed to focus on risk, where before you were 100% focused on just getting ready for audit. So this is a huge boon. This is the kind of game changer that once you have it in your environment, you realize, how did I ever live without it?
Right. Yeah, it's tough to manage the complexity of a security and compliance programs with the spreadsheet. The first SOC auditor that we used had everything in spreadsheets, and it took way longer than it actually should have to get through that audit. So it's nice having everything in a platform. Collecting evidence is very time consuming. So we're actually doing some automatic evidence collection and control testing. One thing that we're using is, we'll connect to our HR platform, have it pull employee lists, monthly changes, and then we'll combine that with information we receive from our ticketing system and our Active Directory reports, right? So we can really make sure, we have an on and offboarding process, but is everyone in the organization following it, right? So we can really check our work. And then for an automated control testing, a lot of our clients have moved to Azure AD, right? So it's great that we can connect to Azure AD, and in one particular instance, I have it collect the password standards quarterly. So we can just review quarterly in Hyperproof. Here are the standards. It passed, and then we have that audit trail throughout the year, showing that evidence that we've collected.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to finish my example out in terms of control testing, I can actually set up a test against that S3 bucket metadata and have it look for the key encryption metadata on each bucket that I have. And if it doesn't comply, if it does not equal 256, AES 256, then I'll automatically kick off a failure of that continuous monitoring of controls and kick off a task to go fix it, right? I think about my old world, I might have caught that literally walking into the audit meeting or within days, and to try to get that fixed in that time, and the sinking feeling in your stomach when you find that, all that gets solved underneath a continuous monitoring methodology where a GRC platform is doing that work for you. So it's just a huge benefit.
Right. And it's another example of alignment, right? And breaking down silos, because you may have a procedure that says, here's how you need to create this, but then having something else in the back end saying, oh, we're verifying how it's being created. I think, and having the audit trail for that is really a game changer. And again, doing that over time and not just right before the audit. It's great to have that.
Yeah. Maybe it'd be useful for me to mention, I'd have 325 controls with just FedRAMP that I'm trying to implement. My target is to automate 80 to 90% of those controls, meaning my plan is to be able to collect the evidence on a routine basis automatically and test that evidence meets a standard for 80 to 90% of that evidence. And one of the benefits of being me is where I can't find an easy test within our platform, I can request it and push it through. But the reality is we're maturing quickly our own FedRAMP environment, and it's paying off benefits into our tool system as well. What we want to do is make it very easy to comply with some of these major regulations and implement a continuous monitoring strategy. So that's what we're doing. All right. So continuous reviews and measuring progress, we've touched on this already. But if you don't have, if you haven't already begun to push into your compliance program continuous monitoring, you should know that it's coming. You should understand that regulations increasingly are building it into their requirements, but you should also understand it's a huge benefit to you. It takes away the stress of one-time spot checks of compliance, and it spreads that out, and it allows you to feel comfortable year-round that you are meeting compliance in a way that maybe before you just couldn't get comfortable around. So you're gonna get a dashboard generally that provides you visibility into where you have gaps in where you don't have 100% compliance, and allow you to focus on those risks with your time rather than chasing down evidence and control. So I just see this as a huge win for anybody who works in information security and compliance. You know, Jason, we have internal procedures about commissioning and decommissioning, platform access, and point in time failures. What I love about a platform like this is it just automates all of that. So tell me a little bit about what you're using this for, and help me understand how you see that benefit.
Sure. Well, I think that the big benefit, and what I try to do my best to communicate internally to our clients, is that, hey, compliance isn't a one-time event, like you alluded to. And there's this whole antiquated idea that compliance can be treated as a checkbox activity. We were talking about this earlier, and it really drives me crazy. There will continue to be new regulations, right? New compliance requirements. And that means you can't just do what you've been doing and expect the same results, right? Just because you passed that audit 2 years ago doesn't mean you will this year with the same exact practices, the same policies that have been rubber stamped. So, I think companies need to evolve their thinking. Understand compliance is both required, and it's actually a measure of what you should be doing, right? Managing your assets, your vendors, and your policy and your practice. These things will meet the compliance standard, right? But also, help lower risk in your organization. So I'm just a huge proponent of getting the basic right and done consistently, and that's exactly what continuous review and a GRC platform does for me. Be able to review these controls right over time and mature them over time.
Yeah, and if you can, I would summarize this as three things. You can lower your risk by being more mature across your entire environment. You can focus key resources on lowering high risk items rather than collecting evidence, and you can create quick and easy reporting that you can share up the chain of command. Those are three pretty powerful things, and implementing continuous monitoring in the right GRC2 tool set will give you those three things. All right. I know this is an important piece. When I think about all of the work that I've done traditionally for compliance, if I went back in time, I would say it was always an information security team, usually one or two people who focused on that. But more and more, because the complexity of compliance and the specificity of control, you are seeing traditional information security tasks get pushed out into the organization, right? A lot of organizations can't necessarily pivot to meet those new demands. So this is really about, hey, do you have the right people, and have you identified the right owners in your organization? But it's also, maybe you don't have them and you need to uplift your organization. And Jason, this is something I think you probably have a regular leg in this part of the industry. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience is?
Exactly. No, this is exactly what we're doing at Curtelligent, both internally and for our clients, right? Trying to break down silos, distribute the workload. So we're often working with CCOs, CFOs, COOs who don't have IT risk as a core competency, right? So that's why we're using GSC platform. We are using Hyperproof to enable that end-to-end solution. So going back to that triangle I mentioned earlier of people, processes, and technology. So you need the people, right? You need the insight on best practices, someone who can help you understand how do you implement a controls framework, what's actually relevant to the business. And I think, there's no surprise. There is a cybersecurity talent shortage, right, across the country, which is why many companies depend on an MSP or MSSP like Cortelligent. And then process. You need to implement this. You need to integrate it into your current workflow, just not a one-time event. Getting that policy into practice, so it's just not aspirational. And then you have to have that technology to orchestrate it all, because security and compliance, which are intertwined but not equivalent, is just too complex to wing it, right? So I think it's much easier to stay compliant when it's done over time, rather than at the last minute, to check a box. You get a better result. Plus, it's less stressful, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, if you're struggling to build out a program, if you're looking for ways to automate, you're not sure where to start. Going and contracting flexible resources is certainly a way to get there. Part of this point, though, is if you have the right people, you've got to understand you've got to distribute the workload also within your own environment, in your own teams. You have to identify critical control owners, make sure they understand their role in the overall mix of compliance, and make sure that communication strategies are in place that bring that team together, whether that's flexible resources or internal resources. So it's a key component. And I think if you have one person who sits in compliance and is trying to do everything, you're going to fail.
Right. No, you really need a team. It is a collaborative effort. Right. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I consult with a lot of our financial services clients, many who have SEC regulatory requirements. And so, it's definitely a group effort for us where we're not doing these mock examinations because, hey, that's just a point in time event. So we want this, continuous improvement, week after week, month after month, identify these compliance gaps, match policy to practice, do an annual incident response tabletop exercise, manage third-party risk, all of that. So going back to what we both said earlier, it's all about, my favorite word, alignment, right? Connecting the dots, linking compliance requirements to controls, to vendors, to responsibilities, and having a GRC platform is really critical to allow everything to work together.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should get T-shirts printed up that says Jason says alignment, but maybe that's for the next one. All right. Well, what I want to do here, Jason, is I want to open up the webinar to questions. I think we've had some engagement in the chat, so I want to give an opportunity for those questions to get answered. So I'll hand it back if you want to hit us with some questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Tom. I'll jump right in. From Nancy, have you seen any incidents where companies have requested and obtained specialized SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports to ensure their key risks, which might not be in an STD report, are addressed?
So the question is, have I seen instances where a company has reached out to a vendor and asked for a SOC 1 or SOC 2 report? I think that's the first part of it. And the answer to that is absolutely. I do it all the time. Not so much SOC 1 as that's more the financial side of the world, but SOC 2 all the time. And then I'm not sure I understood the second half of that question. And Jason, maybe you understood better than I did. But.
Yeah, I think the same here. But we're absolutely collecting any sort of third-party attestation, like a SOC 2 report, when reviewing vendors. Because you could send out due diligence questionnaires all day, but that's just really a self-assessment. So it's nice to have, a third party that can confirm that, what that company said in the self-assessment is actually true.
Okay,
yeah, I would say
great.
SOC 2 in general is a part of every third-party conversation that I have anymore. So it's very common.
Okay, awesome. From Joanne, how are operational resilience risks being defined and managed beyond cyber?
How are operational resilience risks
Being
being,
defined and managed beyond cyber.
well, my purview is cyber, so I'm not sure I'm in the best position to answer beyond cyber. I can tell you that operational resilience is part of almost every major cybersecurity framework. So in terms of BCP and DR, but also in terms of backup and those kinds of risks, those are all addressed underneath the majority of the frameworks that I do work with every day. But I'll also, you know, pivot just a little bit and say that operationally in every organization I am in, IT is critical to those operations, whether it's manufacturing, financial, healthcare, IT services. I've been in all those industries, and the IT capabilities are priority one to keep the operations running. So I see cybersecurity operational risk as organizational risk as a whole in both impact operations. Jason, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just reminded of RSOC 2, and there's not just that cyber component, but the people component as well, and ethics. And so, how are you interviewing people? I think there's that whole other component to it, besides cyber, right?
Yep.
Incident, internal threat program. Something we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I mean, most frameworks also ask for, hey, are you aligning risk, right? Which is operational. Do you have a threat conversation with your board, which is operational? So I would just question exactly where that need or that question comes from, because I feel like most frameworks are blurring the line already between operational risk and cyber risk. But I think in general, most organizations recognize that IT risk to the IT infrastructure is a risk to the ability to operationally succeed in an organization. So,
Okay.
next question.
From Ian, how much does the constant drive towards ever more digital convenience and collaboration with internal and external customers increase a business's risk exposure?
Oh, that's a great question. I would probably just simply say that in every collaborative platform, there's a risk of data leakage. So understanding the data that traverses those systems and educating the user base in what data can and can't traverse those platforms is critical. Things like Slack and Teams and even Zoom and this platform here where, I can collaborate. I have the opportunity to accidentally share data that I shouldn't share. But certainly more prevalent where documents are being exchanged. So you have to be extremely careful and critical of that data and make sure it's not passing in between unintentionally. Jason?
Yeah, Tom, I think for us, it's an evolution of asset management, right? So before it's, you need to know what your assets are so that you can secure them. But now you need to know where your data is and how it flows together, right? So that should just be a prerequisite. So, let's say you're looking into a new vendor. As part of that vendor lifecycle due diligence process, I would, ask yourselves, okay, well, what information are we collecting? Do we need to collect this information? And then after we collected it, where is it going? How is it integrating into other SaaS platforms we're using, right? Because you can't understand your risk and you can't manage it unless you know where that data is going.
Yeah, so data classification is key because users don't necessarily intuit what kind of data that they have. So helping them understand it, and then user training in general, I think, are keys. Next question.
Thank you. From Jeffrey, how do you deal with common controls? Many of those 325 FedRAMP controls are not for the application to respond to.
Not for the application to respond to. So FedRAMP controls are all around sort of how you service an application out to specifically the federal government, but on top of the federal government, it's also commercially adjacent organizations that are providing services to the federal government. So I see them as application control, things like session timeouts and database encryption and separation of roles and responsibilities within an application. All those are app controls. So I see FedRAMP very much as application applicable. Certainly, it has tons of controls that are people and or infrastructure centric as well. But if I understand that question correctly, I would say that I see those as very applicable to the application environment. Jason, do you have anything to add there? That was FedRAMP sort of specific, but
yeah, no, I think you have the privilege of working with FedRAMP, and I don't. So.
Okay, great.
Great. We'll move to the next question from Sergi. How do you approach control testing? Is it risk-based and split by queue?
Yeah, Jason, maybe you can take this first.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So, for control testing, for me, it's trying to, first align that policy and practice. So, am I doing what the paper says we're doing? I can think of an instance particular with a vendor, right? It's, what access does this vendor have into our environment? And being able to pull that from, okay, well, we have an audit log. We see when they're logging in, or we're using sort of a platform with behavioral analytics, so we're getting a bit more information about where they're logging in from. So control testing can be sometimes it's subjective, but really we're just trying to collect evidence from different departments and different platforms to create that really holistic view of, here's how this control works, not just how is it configured and set up, but, how is our SOC managing the alerts, to, what is the experience of the vendor and their access and your communication with them.
Yeah.
So
I look at control testing and I don't necessarily break it down by risk, because to me, any failure on control testing is going to be a problem come audit time. So it all has to get done and it all has to get tested. But I will say this, there is a natural order to how these things get set up. There are very easy control testing, right? I need to pull a policy and make sure I have a policy. That's an easy one. And I can automate that very easily. I have to test encryption on S3 buckets. I can pull that evidence and test it very easily. Then there's the controls that are more difficult to test and where maybe there isn't an easy automation. So I will prioritize those by biggest bang for the buck, and certainly risk is a major variable into that. So it's really looking at that body of work. But at the end of the day, or by the time of audit, I need to have control testing done across the board on all of my controls. So, set them up and knock them down. But certainly when you come to the more difficult control testing, I think you have to prioritize those.
I think one thing, Tom, I think it's important to not just realize you have to test controls, but you may have to test them repeatedly. For example, right, some assets or some controls are more valuable or important to others than others. So even if you tested a control, maybe you need to give yourself a reminder of, okay, in a quarter or every quarter, I am going to test this control because it is important. It's tied to a critical asset. And that's what we do as well in Hyperproof.
Great. Next question.
All right, from Andrew, how do you define continuous? What is the frequency of continuous?
Oh, that's a good question. It's called continuous because there isn't a specified frequency that matches all of the controls, right? So, for instance, I need to review a policy annually, right? But I want to test my password policy monthly. in my platform, I can configure both of those tests as routine, and they will happen on the iteration, the time iteration that is required. So continuous is defined by the control. It's not defined by the platform.
Okay,
Jason,
awesome.
do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think just the one thing I'm thinking of is, there may be a compliance requirement to test your backups annually, but in reality, you may want to do it more frequently than that. We have reminders in Hyperproof to do just that, to test, the restorations, and then, hey, while we're doing it, we'll pull that evidence into the platform, right? And now we have evidence of 4 test restores across the year. I think it just makes everyone feel confident. Controls are working like they should, and always impresses the auditor as well.
Yeah, for sure. Next.
Okay, great. This was directed to Jason. Jason, you mentioned the cybersecurity shortage. As someone having a hard time finding employment, what are your suggestions on getting that started?
I was looking at a website today, reminding myself that it did show, there is just such a critical shortage of cybersecurity professionals versus the positions. So if you're having a hard time hiring, well, sometimes I think it's hard to create the justification, right, to hire someone. You may be a small company and can't hire a CISO, right, or you can't hire your own SOC team. So I think that's why companies have been looking to MSPs or MSSPs like Cortelligent to sort of augment their staff or their capabilities, where, in that fractional manner, or sort of, ongoing, if you aren't familiar with compliance or how to implement it, seeking sort of outside help rather than trying to hire internally.
Jason, I think the specific question was he was having trouble getting hired. So he's looking for advice on how he can get hired. And so I will interject just a little bit and suggest a couple things. One is your network is critical. So build your network, but also build your network in places where it makes sense. So, if you're not using tools like TryHackMe and Discord and really building in the community of information security, then you're not building the right community around yourself. So that's key, and continuing to build out your resources in terms of skills is critical. And then the last thing I would say is, try to make yourself known on things like LinkedIn regularly. So post relevant data to what you want, the kind of job that you want to have, reach out to the right people in that platform that are hiring, and you'll have some success.
I think that the one takeaway I have is try informational interviews, right? So you can reach out to someone on LinkedIn saying, hey, I saw this position. I may not be qualified, but I'm interested in your company. I'd love to learn more about it. And often you'll have someone, take you up on your offer for 30 minutes to, share what the position is about or their experiences in cybersecurity. And that's another way to, build your networking.
Okay, outstanding. I really want to thank the audience. We had so many questions and a lot of engagement, and way to go on a great presentation and Q&A session, Tom and Jason. We appreciate it. For the audience, please, if you have any further questions or if questions went unanswered, feel free to reach out to Hyperproof at info@hyperproof.io.